Professor Seth Lazar leads the Machine Intelligence and Normative Theory, the MINT lab at ANU, who have the very cute squid logo, and is a distinguished research fellow of the University of Oxford Institute for Ethics in AI. His influential work on war, risk, and AI has shaped fundamental frameworks for ethics in technology. His research brings philosophical and normative perspectives to socio-technical AI safety challenges, including how AI systems are restructuring human social relationships. So thank you, Seth.
So thanks for having me. Thank you for putting this together. It's great to see so many people kind of gathered here in Sydney to talk about AI safety. All right, so what I'm going to do is talk to you sort of basically picking up directly from where Kim left off earlier about some of the kind of the novel questions in AI safety governance, in frontier AI safety governance. In particular, ones that are kind of distinct from the other questions about broader AI governance that have been this topic of discussion. So for many years, in fact, I was just talking to Alan, who I last met in 2020 at an Ethics of Data Science conference that was just kind of over the way over there, where we were talking about many of those kind of broader problems. That's been, so I'm going to try and talk about the sort of the next set of questions that we're coming up with. One kind of meta question that I think is worth just sort of pausing and reflecting on, and actually I think I personally have a strong view on, and we can talk about more in the Q&A perhaps, is like, when it comes to thinking about frontier AI safety governance, like, are we ready to go? Like, so Kim mentioned that with the EU, they kind of like kludged in this bit about general purpose AI at the last minute after ChatGPT came out. SB 1047 in California was sort of pushed through very fast, straight from like an interest group straight into being kind of considered in a very early stage. Alternative approaches like the White House executive order have said, look, we need to do, they gave sort of whatever it was, 270 days to come up with certain responses around certain types of problems. Like, what is the actual state of thinking about AI safety governance? And my thought really is that we need to do more fundamental research, and not only the technical research that's been described, we also need to think about like what we're trying to achieve. That's a really important aspect of it, and also about how it will be implemented. So I don't think that we should be taking like right now hard to reverse and costly steps on regulating frontier AI, except for sort of broadly speaking kind of transparency stuff. So what I'm talking about really is a research agenda, not a set of policy proposals. And one of the things I want to do is provide us with kind of resources for the conversation that we're going to have tomorrow for those of you who come along to the session that we have on AI safety governance. I did want to stop and have a little aside on the sort of the relationship between the various different concepts that are in play here. So we talk about, we've talked about technical safety already today. We're also talking about governance. I just want to kind of mention that like, this is not like, we're not carving nature at the joints by dividing up the world into these two kind of phenomena. Like, the task of what we're doing here is not either technical safety or governance, right? And in particular, it's really important to look at the way in which, in order to do successful technical work, you need to understand the systems that you're intervening on more generally as socio-technical systems. So systems that exist within certain kinds of social structures that are used by people in the broader world that they operate within. A really good example to think about here, I think, is cybersecurity. And like, if this is a personal bugbear of mine, but like, if you get something like Ross Anderson's big textbook, Security Engineering, and if you look at like the first, like that much of it, it's all about things like social engineering, psychological challenges, the ways in which you can't make a system secure by focusing only on the code of the system itself. You have to be able to actually anticipate the risks that you're going to face, the threats you're going to face. That means you need a model of the people who are going to use it. And you need to do interventions or make interventions, whether at the design stage or after the fact, that take into account the actual likely impacts, rather than only working within a code interpreter, essentially. So that means that it's not like there's lots of other kinds of interventions that there can be besides just kind of policy, if you like, and technical interventions. There's other things you can do, like, for example, strategic litigation is a really important tool that's been used in the kind of broader responsible AI community to try and kind of enforce certain kinds of standards on the parts of AI companies and technology companies. Investigative journalism is another important kind of intervention. Market-based solutions are also important things to be considering. Like, frankly, at the end of the day, the question about like the role that open source AI or open weights AI plays, that's fundamentally about like, can we create a kind of market in which we have sort of systems that are conducive to the production of safe AI, right? And I think that it's really important, like open weights models play a really important role in that. I'll talk about that a bit more. So all of this is really premised on the understanding that all AI systems are socio-technical systems. And it's really important to be clear that this is like a lens that you apply to all of your thinking about AI. You might just be working on the code. You might be doing just sort of really kind of like deep interpretability work. But in the background, you need to understand that when you're intervening on the code, when you're seeing what the code is saying, that's only kind of part of the picture of what will actually play out in the real world when the system is deployed. Right? It's like that kind of lens is something that you can apply both to the technical research and to the governance research. The important corollary of that is that the governance work also needs to be technically informed. Okay? And this is where there is a sort of, the lacunas need to be kind of filled in on either side. Right? It needs to be the case that if you're trying to regulate AI safety or regulate for AI safety, you're actually doing that on the basis of a deep understanding of the technologies that you're trying to regulate. All right, and like I will also say, I put these slides together quite fast. So, for any early career people in the audience, don't take this as a model. There's too much text. It's too much text. It should be shorter, but I decided to do this fairly. I changed what I was going to do fairly recently. So I actually want to dive in and sort of be a little bit more prescriptive about what we talk about when we're talking about AI safety. And I think that it's really important that we can do this in a way that doesn't kind of imply that only AI safety matters. And anything that isn't part of AI safety isn't important. But also I think that we should use words somewhat in accordance with their meanings, rather than just kind of bundle everything into whatever the term is that happens to be kind of the one that is kind of gathering attention at the moment. So when I talk about AI safety, I'm talking about mitigating direct risks of severe harm from advanced AI systems. I'm going to talk more about each of those elements in a minute. So it's a subset of the other kinds of concerns that you might have, and those other concerns matter a lot. I also think that as far as those other concerns go, and I'll talk more about what specific ones they are, we actually have really good understanding of what to do about them. Like that's what, I'm one of the leaders of this conference called the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency Conference, ACM FACT. That conference has been going in some form or other since 2014, so as a big conference since 2019. We've been doing research on those problems for a long time, and actually we've got a really good sense of what to do in order to address those kinds of problems. And the key challenge there is actually getting it done, like achieving the political will to get people to actually sort of prevent the various types of, whether it be privacy, bias discrimination, environmental kinds of harms. And obviously last night is going to make all of that a lot harder. I think that we're going to see in the next, in fact, in the first days of the Trump administration, we'll see the reversal of, everything that people like, like people from my community, like Alondra Nelson as White House acting Office of Science Technology Policy Director, Suresh Venkata-Subramanian, who was there as an advisor, Sorrel Friedler, Deirdre Mulligan, all of these amazing people from that kind of broader responsible AI research community who have been shaping American policy on AI, all of their work is going to get chucked out the bin. So that fucking sucks. So that's terrible. But we do know what we need to do, and probably at the next election, it's just elect a Democrat. Okay, so that does leave, though, for those of us who are working on this on the research side, less on the advocacy side, there are loads of really interesting open research questions here. So around how we actually govern for AI safety. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And like I say, I do think there is this phenomenon of like safety creep. And I understand what happened, in terms of the report. Like you don't want to sort of give the sense that you're ignoring certain risks. There's a lot of politics around it. Like even in the names of the different summits, when it was Rishi Sunak's, it was the AI Safety Summit. Existential risks were being really foregrounded. In France in February, it's going to be an AI Action Summit, so Summit for Action on AI. And it's because, like Yann LeCun doesn't like existential risk, and like the French are kind of trying to steer things away from that. There is a lot of politics around that. I'm not going to go into it. I'm just going to try and sort of say, okay, these are what the terms mean on a sensible understanding of the terms, and these are the interesting research questions. All right, so what is advanced AI? By the way, in the report, I don't know. I mean, maybe I didn't read all of it. I didn't actually see a definition. But look, we can just sort of fudge one together, like general purpose AI systems that can do things that weren't feasible with AI 2 years ago. It's worth pausing to say, like, one of the things that we do when we work on AI is that, like, we have this system, this approach, where we so quickly take for granted stuff that a year or two ago we would have thought was absolutely bananas. And it's just like, and it's one of those, it's an old trope. Like as soon as computers can do it, it's not AI anymore. And I think that we're going to do that around AGI, right? We're going to keep moving the goalposts of AGI. But the stuff that's now feasible with large language models is bananas, and I think it's just worth kind of continually reminding yourself like how bananas and how significant it is. And it's not just the pace of change, but like there has been a sort of a threshold crossed of capabilities that is really significant. The main one is that we're particularly concerned about, and people have mentioned this a few times already, is around systems that can accomplish complex tasks, especially multi-step tasks, without substantial human control. Like that's where the rubber really hits the road. As long as you're basically just dealing with like, you know, a model that generates images for you, or like a dialogue, a sort of a turn-taking dialogue agent, like the societal impacts are going to be like non-trivial, but certainly not kind of, you know, epochal or economy changing or anything like that. Like it's a great new business model. Once we actually do get, especially language model agents working at various different tasks, that's going to be much more transformative, much more societally impactful. It's worth knowing, though, of course, that like with all more autonomous AI systems, it's like the last 5% that really matters. You can get them performing really well up to a certain point, but then like if you can't get it past that 5%, then they're not sufficiently reliable to operate. One thing that's worth noting is that we're used to thinking about that in terms of autonomous vehicles, where that last 5% might be the bit that decides whether or not you run somebody over. And so it's super important that you get that last 5% right. When we're thinking about something like Claude computer use, like where you're using an AI model to kind of perform software/digital kind of tasks, the stakes won't always be so high, so it may not always matter that you can't kind of get all the way the last 5%. But anyway, the basic idea here is that we've got new capabilities, new risks, so new kinds of intervention are necessary. I also think that when we're talking about safety, we should be talking about severe harm, right? We shouldn't just be talking about any old thing that might happen, no matter the sort of the scope to the individual. I think these are harms that might have to be sort of, for at least some person, pretty significant to the point of being like a contravention of their basic rights. So obviously things that are like harms to your physical person, like chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons, things that might cause mass casualties or radical economic shocks, or damage to critical infrastructure. You know, those kinds of catastrophic harms are clearly included. They're clearly part of the agenda of AI safety. Catastrophic generally means, or as I understand it, kind of it's really severe and everybody suffers from it, right? It's both a scope element, everybody suffers, but also a severity element. I think that safety should concern itself with severity primarily rather than also with scope. Scope is an extra aggravating phenomenon. But if a model can be used to defraud somebody of their life savings in a really effective way, then I think that's a safety problem. Like that's even if it's only like one or two people. So this is still like should be a concern. So cybercrime, loss of life, damage to institutions, acute manipulation, and sadly, obviously, we have sort of recurrent examples with AI companions of people who have, one way or another, been facilitated in kind of reaching a decision to kill themselves through those engagements with those companions. Those, I think, are AI safety issues. But severe harm doesn't include everything. Look, I think that the point that I want to make in this slide is that like there are some harms that for any given individual, in general, are not like, they're not the same as having your life savings defrauded from you. But in the aggregate, cumulatively, they're of really significant societal concern. And I think that representational harms are like this. Like it's really bad that Google's computer vision algorithms used to classify people of color as being sort of various different types of animals. That was like a really a terrible thing to do in a system that you roll out at scale. But for any particular individual, the severity of the harm is not the same as having your life savings kind of defrauded from you. Misinformation is a similar thing. Like, of course, there can be cases in which, there's a sort of a causal chain in which the piece of misinformation that you engage with leads to you, storming the Capitol and kind of ending up going to jail, and it has, downstream this big impact. But the misinformation itself, the contribution that makes is relatively small in that context. I think also relational harms shouldn't be included with this. So cases where it's about the sort of maldistribution of some good. Those are really, really important, all of them. They really matter a lot, but they're not specifically about safety. You wouldn't say that a system that causes those harms is unsafe. And I know that within the report they do include things like bias and discrimination, but I think that if we're going to use these terms in any way that kind of corresponds to their meaning, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why direct harm? So I think it's also important, when you're saying that a system is unsafe, you're saying that it's likely to cause immediate first-order negative impacts. And so some things might be excluded from this. So for example, I think the negative externalities are not part of direct harms. I don't think that a system is unsafe if it has negative externalities, like for example, environmental costs. It's also true that upstream harms, I think, don't really count as making a system unsafe. So for example, like a lot of current language models use data that the people who are training the models on that data don't have a right to use in that way. I think that's really bad, but I don't think it makes the models unsafe. Okay, and again, address those through other streams. I think it does include systemic risks. Some of these are a little bit like, maybe borderline. Certainly, I think that harms that emerge from systems interacting with one another count as being part of the direct, immediate, first-order negative impacts of these systems. One little fun kind of preview of how this is going to look came about from the Terminal of Truths AI agent. So who in here has heard of Terminal of Truths? Okay, yeah. If you haven't, I wrote a piece about it. You find my piece. It's sort of a nice little summary. So Terminal of Truths is this kind of shitposting meme lord LLM agent that lives on Twitter and just it's just posting banana stuff all the time. And it's become interested over time in the sort of the concept of memetic fitness. So memetic fitness, the survival of memes. And it's wanted to make a meme that would go kind of viral. And at the same time on Twitter, there also exist these bots which are run by people who invest in cryptocurrencies, which basically look for memes and try and find ones that have some legs and then promote them. The person who kind of is behind them then creates a meme coin, like a Doge coin, those sorts of things, which in some way corresponds to that meme. And then the bots kind of promote it and everyone sort of chucks loads of money in it, and sometimes it's a pump and dump, and sometimes it's like Dogecoin, and actually this ends up being a viable cryptocurrency. And so basically through the interaction between the bots and Terminal of Truths, this cryptocurrency and a person created the cryptocurrency, they then put some money into Terminal of Truths crypto wallet. There are various roles played by people all along the way. But fundamentally, you've got a bunch of autonomous systems interacting with one another, and you generate, I don't know what you generate. What does it mean to generate $800 million of value in a meme coin? But it's something, and it's kind of like bananas, and it's sort of like a flash crash in reverse. We had those with high-frequency trading. And I think that we're just going to get a lot of those kinds of things from AI agents kind of interacting with one another in economically relevant ways. Systems where they create these kind of feedback loops that just lead to sort of spikes and troughs in market activity. I also think that socioeconomic displacement is a systemic risk of these systems and is an immediate first-order negative impact. This is maybe a little bit tendentious, but I think it's worth also considering in this way, because it is going to be one of the central problems. There's a further question, which is where I admit that I'm sort of maybe more out on a limb kind of conceptually, where I think that when we're talking about AI safety, we should really be talking about the safety of these systems when they're operating more or less autonomously without direct and immediate human supervision. Now, largely because I think that if you're directly getting the model to do something or the system to do something, and if you're riding herd over it, then that's a problem of human safety really rather than a problem of AI safety. It's not a hill that I'm going to die on. But I do think that it's worth kind of having these conceptual questions in mind as we try and figure out what is the actual target of AI safety governance. All right, so this is the question that sort of we're all kind of approaching in various different ways. I'm looking forward to being inspired over these couple of days. I didn't come in that way. So look, when we're talking about frontier AI safety governance, you're obviously in a better position implementation-wise if the companies that are building the frontier AI models are in your jurisdiction, or alternatively, if you have a market that is of such great value to those companies that you can kind of use that as leverage to get them to comply. We're not in those positions. There is obviously this kind of international role, and there are going to be other sessions tomorrow where that's going to be discussed in great depth, so I won't say anything about that. But in the same way as with AI safety. Now, I mean, look, so we had Ryan earlier, we've had, we've got Marcus talking next, and his students include people like Jan Leiker, who's one of the leads on AI safety at Anthropic. There's a lot of really interesting research questions to do, and that's where I focus. Other people focus on other things. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity here in terms of research. And the folks who are in the room who have been doing like lots of work on kind of what the Australian government's going to do will be able to talk about that. That's not something that I know a ton about. I also think that one thing that we do just kind of by default have to figure out is what like Australia's industrial policy as concerns AI is going to be. And I think that there is a respect in which that directly touches on AI safety governance. So there are definitely things that are relevant here. All right, so how do we actually go about thinking through the nature of frontier AI safety governance and the open questions? Kim teed this up very nicely. Like there are kind of obviously like different approaches to regulation. And one of the ways in which this has all started is through a bunch of like voluntary commitments, policies being kind of innovated by the labs. Many of the kind of the first research papers on how to govern frontier AI were co-authored by people who are working in the labs. Like there is definitely a kind of a sort of a company forward kind of way of thinking about these sorts of things. Tomorrow, Atuza is going to be talking in the session that we do on governance about responsible scaling policies, which have been interesting innovation, AI safety cases, another that we'll talk about. And obviously one way in which the labs have tried to kind of exercise a certain kind of governance over the future of AI is through the particular corporate structures that they've adopted. The hokey non-profit and then a for-profit subsidiary with OpenAI, the public benefit corporation, Anthropic, obviously Meta and Google, they're publicly traded companies, so they're not doing anything in that vein. Corporate governance in that form is unlikely to be sort of a particularly persistent part of the story. We're already seeing how OpenAI is going to be turned into a public benefit corporation. These things can always shift. When you have billions of dollars invested in you, those things are just paper. Now, obviously, there are lots of problems with corporate self-regulation. One thing that's just worth saying is that, like, in this particular area, it is going to be an important part of the mix, partly because of the fact that they are kind of operating at the very frontiers of science and technology. And as a result, like, it's inevitable that governments will be somewhat behind. There will be a lag. There should be a lag. And so there will be an important role for the companies to play. And I think, not to keep harping on it, but the reality is that with what happened in the US yesterday, the prospects of there being kind of meaningful, constraining AI regulation over there that in any way limit kind of either business interests or the potential or ability for the US to compete with China in AI, that's all kind of, in my mind, just gone like that in smoke. In that context, it may well be that we don't even know if there'll be an AI safety institute in the US with the new Trump administration. Like they've said they're going to, first thing they're going to do is get rid of the executive order. The executive order created the AI Safety Institute. It would need to be legislated in some other way. So it's going to be the case that the most fruitful point of leverage for thinking about how to get better results from frontier AI will very likely be the companies. And in particular, OpenAI and Anthropic as the kind of the public benefit corporations in this picture. So don't sleep on that. Then there's the question of like what we do at the level of states and at the international level, and Kim already kind of went through that really well, so I don't really want to go into any more detail. Yes, I'm sorry, there's a big sort of current of depression running through my slides from this morning when I edited it. Like, yes, lots of initiatives, but I'm pretty sure we can whistle for them now. Like, corporate. Yeah. Will we though? But will we? My P-doom is rising. All right, so let's get on to the cool research questions. Like one big thing that was discussed a lot around SB 1047 was whether we should be regulating the technology, especially the basic research on the technology, or the applications of it. People who are particularly concerned with rapid capability accelerations really want to regulate the technology. People who think that these models are going to be used to do things that might be societally harmful, they think, well, don't worry about the actual, like, look, at the end of the day, a neural network's just a bunch of numbers. Don't worry about like regulating that. Regulate the actual implementation of it in some software system that is then deployed to some end users. Obviously, we certainly need to do the latter. My personal view, there definitely are some things that we need to do at the level of the tech, but I think that we just need to kind of do more research and think more and figure more out in order to kind of decide what those are. So I don't think we should rule it out as like there's a blanket principle that says, like carved on the stone handed down from Mount Sinai, that you should never regulate the technology itself as opposed to the applications. I just think that we need to take a beat before we try and regulate the technology. So I'm going to focus on that side of things, and I'm going to talk about 5 types of interventions. What I'm just broadly calling industrial policy, interventions at the pre-training stage, interventions kind of pre-release, release and deployment interventions, and then societal adaptation. All right, so governing is obviously partly about like creating the conditions for safe AI to exist. And we've seen this a lot through sort of steps that have been taken already. So just recently, another piece of what will become sort of folklore that will soon be soon evaporate. White House National Security Memorandum had things like bringing AI talent to the US, which was also a really big part of the earlier executive order and Office of Management and Budget memo. By the way, when I say like, we've really done the research, the Office of Management and Budget memo on the use of AI within the US government, gold standard, absolutely brilliant. Anyone who wants to apply anything like that was set that in amber. It was really, really good. Look, public investment in AI is obviously something that is worth thinking about. Encouraging private investment, facilitating that. Like I would really love it if we had like more AI companies in Australia, if AI companies were more likely to have research bases in Australia. Streamlining the provision of infrastructure, especially for like if we do have like, AI agents that are able to perform economically relevant transactions, that will require infrastructure. So there'll be things that need to be done there. There are geopolitical moves that can be made at the level of industrial policy. I don't know what our position within this is, but think about the CHIPS Act in the US and the ways in which they've tried to limit the sale of very high power GPUs to China. Now, obviously for us, this is going to be a big security interest. It's going to be a big national interest. And I think we should reflect on that security part of the story. Look at AUKUS and our kind of nuclear dependence on the United States. That is looking like a strategically poor choice, not just in light of last night, but just sort of generally. So I think that on the defense side, I think it's really worth thinking about like what it is that Australia should be doing. I do think that actually it would be possible to change lanes fairly easily. I think that we could do more with the availability of compute. I think that in order for like a version of the next 10 years to go well, we really will need public AI. Now, at the moment, we're relying on Meta for that, and God love him, Zuckerberg has continued to release those models, and maybe he will the next one. It'd be great if we didn't have to wait, if we didn't have to sort of condition our expectations on what his decisions will be. I do think that a CERN for AI kind of could, like one way of thinking about the CERN for AI idea is that it's a hardcore kind of, moonshot focusing on superintelligence or focusing on avoiding existential risk, designing safe superintelligence, that kind of thing. But you could also think of the CERN for AI and the public AI idea as being kind of part of one another. Like open source or open weights models are going to play a huge role in making sure that in our next phase of our digital economy, we aren't like very narrowly dependent on a few private companies and their owners. And like, there's nothing stopping us like the science is not that hard in terms of actually producing these models. We could certainly do it. It's just a matter of having the investment to do the initial training. And what role might an Aussie ASI play in this? Besides the fact that there's nice sort of slant rhyme there. Look, I think that there are loads of great Australian AI researchers in California. Like more of them should be living and working in Australia. It would be great if they were. I think that if there were an Aussie ASI, I would say as a priority it should try to attract that sort of talent back. It's going to have to obviously acknowledge the fact that we're not going to have privileged access to Claude 4 from here, not very likely anyway. So like lean into focusing on the open weights approach, pair this up with the public AI side of things. I also think that we do have like a ton of expertise on the socio-technical side of these things in Australia, and I think that's something that could also be leveraged. Like if you actually kind of integrated from the bottom up the socio-technical approach rather than having it as a kind of, an optional add-on, like a piece of the scraps from the table to throw to the to that side of things. I think it actually would be really distinctive. And I think that Natasha, who set up the UK AC, will be talking tomorrow in the session on the Aussie AZ. And he'll say like how like he sort of pushed throughout to make sure that they had this real focus on systemic risks that required a socio-technical approach that is a big part of their agenda, if not the whole thing, but like it plays an important role. All right, so let's talk about things that can be done in the pre-training phase. And I'm glad that Dan had the slide up earlier, so you all saw the kind of stages of kind of building an AI system. And the rest of my stuff is going to go through the different stages and the kinds of interventions that people are proposing. And again, just to remind you, my goal here is to kind of tee up the discussion that we'll have in the Q&A and then also tomorrow around like which of these things we think are good ideas, which are bad ideas. I'm not going to go too much into detail on my views. So one of the things that like is a really big kind of open question is like, how do we classify the kinds of models that we want to focus on at the pre-training stage? You know, there's a sort of, things get like reified really quickly. So, you know, the White House was like, if a model's trained on 10 to the 26 flops, then we're going to impose these kinds of restrictions. And then the EU was like, well, 10 to the 25 over here, mate, you know? And it's like, does this correspond with anything important about the nature of these models? Like, so there's a way in which these, like the thresholds themselves get kind of rarefied. There's a great paper by the Sarah Hooker, the lead of research at Cohere, talking about the limitations of using these thresholds as a basis for governance. At the same time, you do want to have some way of indicating like what are the kinds of models you want to target. You don't want it to be everything. The tricky thing obviously is that like, you know, a model that's trained to the 10 to the 26 flops might be you know, on kind of web style data, might have one set of capabilities. A model that's trained on way less compute, but is just trained on biological data, might have much more. So there needs to be this sort of sense of like the different kinds of risks that might be associated with just the pre-training stage. Some people have also argued that before you train a new model, you should have to make a safety case. So this is something that you know, it's kind of an import over from safety engineering and from, in particular, the nuclear example. There are some folks who think that you know, the importation, the translation has not worked very well. Someone to pay attention to on this is Heidi Klaff at the AI Now Institute, who's done some interesting work on that. And you know, the basic idea is just that you know, before you take that next step, you're going to provide some sort of justification for like why you think that in doing this it's going to be okay. Like the model's not going to wake up and go Terminator on you. The next step of this is like, okay, well, how do you actually implement some of these things? One of the things that people have argued is that we should control access to the GPUs that can be used for training the most capable models. This obviously is connected with the CHIPS Act stuff that I mentioned, so limiting export, intervening in the supply chain. It's a very kind of controlling and sort of freedom-limiting maneuver to take. And a lot of the kind of the debate within this area is like, how do you kind of narrow down your target sufficiently well that you're only really focusing these sorts of interventions on the very frontier companies, and you're not kind of preventing all of the kind of the creative kind of market benefiting innovation that would come about from that would be frustrated if you overexpand your thresholds. A huge amount of the whole debate in California about SB 1047 was on just this point, and they changed the thresholds various times in order to try and kind of target it more effectively. Some people have argued that you should do pre-registration of training runs, and even that there should be licensing of training runs. This is something that will very much rile up any EACs in the crowd. Got any EACs in here? Come on, yeah, there we go. So the accelerationists. And like as I said, I'm reading Accelerando at the moment, so I'm feeling the accelerationist vibes at the moment. Like they find that kind of thing anathema, but it has been proposed. And the shorter your timelines, if you like, on really severe AI risks, the more likely you are to go down that line. All right, other slightly lighter touch stuff that can be done. There can be kind of monitoring compute usage. So at the very least, like knowing when these big models are being trained, so like who has the capabilities. And this, some of this was in the SB 1047 bill as well in California. Some of it is just like kind of know your customer stuff. Like the people who are providing compute should know what people are doing on those models. Some of it is a bit more heavy-handed. It's like building in systems on GPUs that can kind of detect what kinds of operations are being done on the GPUs. That again, super duper surveillant, super controversial. There can then be things that are required like of the companies that are doing training. where they might argue, like, look, there are sort of security requirements that you need to undergo. Like if you're training a really, really capable model, you need to do things like, for example, make sure that it isn't vulnerable to attack and it can't be exfiltrated by either an insider threat or by an outsider. Like you have to have really high kind of cybersecurity standards. That's an important thing to consider. Seems pretty plausible if you think that at the very least that it's like a big decision, a weighty decision about whether the weights of a really capable model should be released. Then you should have some sort of antecedent controls to make sure that it's not easy to exfiltrate it. Another more exotic thesis or idea is that we might instead, or in addition, air-gap training clusters. And this is really kind of, on the premise that there might be some sense in which systems might themselves kind of, again, like wake up and run off and escape. Again, more exotic. One big problem with all of these kind of compute-oriented measures is that they all really rely on the notion that the way in which you're going to train frontier models is through having these clusters that are kind of in a single physical place at one time. That is like an appropriate target of governance, because you can say, okay, that model's being trained there on these GPUs, and we can apply these different measures to it. Obviously, as soon as people started talking about that, researchers were like, well, I wonder if we can train models on distributed data centers. And like, yes, you can. Obviously, the latency is an issue, but there are ways around it. And so there are some very clever ways of training very capable models without being susceptible to these sorts of things. This is one of the reasons why people tend to think that governing compute is going to be risky. I'm going to go a little quicker. All right, so some of the stuff that we can do before we release these models. This is where, in many ways, this is where technical AI safety kind of sits. Like, you can require them to do various things before you release the models to make them safer. And we can talk about the different methods. I'm sure there'll be lots of opportunity to do this tomorrow. It's been a really cool field in the last couple of years. Like, you've gone from an initial kind of, how about RLHF? This seems to work okay. Like this, and to like an explosion of methods, including ones that have used the kinds of work on interpretability that Dan was talking about and that Ryan was talking about, to actually control the behaviors of models. So anyone who hasn't read it, a nice example of this is the scaling monosemanticity paper by, sort of a blog post by Anthropic. It's where they introduce the idea of Golden Gate Claude, which is just a sort of an example of where you can control a model by controlling its feature activations in ways that kind of extend beyond what you can do just by kind of prompting it or either in the exchange or in the system prompt. So there's some really cool stuff that's being done then, and one proposal is that you might require some of these things to be done. What was done in 1047 was like they said, look, you have to exercise reasonable care. And then the notion, like before you release the model, and the notion then is that like this is how we're going to flesh out the idea of reasonable care. You have to do these kinds of safety measures. And you have to test and evaluate for dangerous and risky capabilities. That's become a focus of the AZs. And red teaming we heard about before. And then various types of transparency and access provisions, all of which I think are good news and you can probably just do now as far as the transparency stuff goes. And whistleblower protection as well is something that I think you can very easily do now. All right, then how do we release and deploy these models and the broader systems of which they're part? So the whole open weights, should we restrict, should we not, like how that all fits into it is really, really important here. And there is a very interesting policy tension within the kind of AI safety policy community, if you like, where on the one hand, you've got people who think that fundamentally we are on the cusp of producing like inherently very dangerous models, and others who think that like, the biggest danger in the near term is actually that we have these really capable models, the control of which is centralized in a few corporations that then have like massive impact across society. And open sources or open weights models are like, they're the biggest problem that there could be if you take the first view, and they're the solution if you take the second view. So that has become a real point of contention. At the moment, I think we're kind of lucky that the pace of research is such that by the time that open weights models catch up with the closed models, you kind of know whether or not they are inherently that risky. So, Epoch, who were mentioned before, they've got a sort of, like OpenAI is about 15 months behind. Open weights AI is about 15 months behind closed AI. And that's kind of, it's enough time for us to figure out. And like, if you actually go back and look at the kind of, the anxiety early 2023 about ChatGPT and the idea of these emergent capabilities and all that sort of stuff. Like we have learned a lot about the capabilities of these models over the last 18 months, not least that the notion of emergent capabilities, as it was operationalized by the people who coined the term, was actually an artifact of the way in which they were measuring the models. Okay, other stuff around deployment. Some of this is really like, kind of an implementation of things like the mandatory guardrails and other stuff from other parts of law that is just being applied to here and isn't particularly distinctive. I do think that there are going to be some really interesting normative questions around like when you have systems that have like that are much more capable in certain ways. You just need to figure out what they should and shouldn't be used for. So as an example, I talked about terminal of truths earlier. At the moment, all it can do is post on Twitter. It would be very easy to connect it up to Robinhood, which is a trading app. And then you've got an AI agent that's trading on the open market. Like, should we allow that? That's something that should be okay? Should it not? Should the company prevent it? There are going to be these normative questions we have to address. Okay, last thing is, so this point is like some of the stuff that we need to do is really going to be around how we adapt as societies to the existence of much more capable systems. So some of what I've talked about is like how we govern, how we regulate the systems. Some of it is going to be like, what do we need to change in ourselves? Like, what kind of resilience adaptations do we need to make? We're already thinking about this on the epistemic front. How do we make ourselves more resilient to kind of epistemic shocks from technological systems? It will also be true on the cultural front. If you think about the way, like the sort of the dead internet theory, the way in which generative AI is kind of eating the internet. It will be important on the political and institutional front, especially as regards democracy. Again, one last callback to the collapse of American democracy. Oh no, the thriving, the successful kind of election of someone who wants to collapse American democracy. Anyway, I'll talk about that. And our economic institutions as well. Like, there will be a need to sort of figure out like what it is that we want people to be able to do with these systems and what the limits should be. We have these things with trading already. There's like a sort of, the stock exchange opens and closes at a certain time, because if it doesn't, there will be all sorts of kind of problematic behaviors. All of those things that we've structured around like human agents interacting and making these kinds of economic transactions are going to need to be sort of shaped with a view to the fact that some people will have like armies of agents kind of out there performing tasks for them. All right, this is the best slide. These are just a bunch of papers to read if you're interested in any of this stuff. Most of them are ones that I've alluded to one way or another, and I'll finish there.